You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Amity Shlaes, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also a syndicated columnist for Bloomberg and has appeared on numerous radio and TV shows over the years. She has written the books Germany, The Empire Within, about Germany at the time of reunification, and after that she wrote the book The Greedy Hand, How Taxes Drive Americans Crazy and What to Do About It. And her most recent national bestseller is The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, which talks about the Great Depression in the United States and the New Deal and how Presidents Herbert Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt dealt with the policies in a way that perhaps was counterproductive and, in fact, prolonged the Depression. Anyway, I'd like to, first of all, Emily, welcome you to the show.
Oh, thank you.
Let me ask you a question. One of the, actually the introduction that I'd like to give is that I was originally introduced to your book by one of my colleagues who is the president of an investment company that we work with in Florida, and he read your book and he said, everyone has to read this book. So he went out and bought a whole bunch of copies and sent it out to everyone. And so we constantly discussed the theories behind it, and one of the questions that came up was, what happened after the recession of 1920 that led to the Roaring '20s, and then later we had the crash of 1929 that led to the Great Depression? Why was there a difference in the way the follow-up from these two crashes, and are there any parallels perhaps that we would even see today?
Well, the recession of the early 20s is a forgotten recession. We don't remember it, and that's because it was so brief. It was rather severe. Unemployment went up in our cities to 19%. That's a very high number for the United States, but only momentarily. So you want to ask, what were the policies that made this recession not so bad, or bad but fast? And the answer is not what you think. The government was in the middle of cutting spending, so you see actually the federal government having its budget in a couple of years around that time. They didn't stop cutting the budget because of the recession. On the contrary, and they raised interest rates quite significantly going into the recession because of a concern about inflation. So those are things that break the rules, modern rules. What? Oh my gosh, they cut spending and they raised interest rates, and yet the economy came back rather fast. Soon we were at unemployment not of 19% in cities, but nationally overall of something below 5. The 20s were a great decade. The U.S. had serious growth in the 20s and very low unemployment, and that too is a contradiction of what some of us have learned. Usually we are taught you pick your poison, you take unemployment or you take inflation, you take trouble or trouble. So everything was kind of copacetic in the 20s. It was the opposite of the 1970s, where we had both unemployment and inflation, stagflation. Mm-hmm. So you want to compare that? You wanted to compare that to 29. I would mention a couple other things. They didn't intervene in the labor market in the early 20s. There's some politicians already on the scene, such as Herbert Hoover, wanted to. They said, well, the labor price should go down if the bosses can't pay the worker. Mm-hmm. And that's not a Keynesian thing to say, as we say in modern language. So the labor price went down. They paid people less. They laid people off, but then they rehired them because there weren't too many obstacles in their way. There was no new law that said you had to pay high wages. There was nothing to make an employer hesitate to rehire. In 29, oh my gosh, they had a different attitude. They believed in strong government intervention, and Herbert Hoover, who was the president at the moment of the crash, called our company leaders to Washington and said, you must not lower wages, or you must keep them high, because then the worker will spend. That's a very familiar argument. It's one we've heard ever since World War II around the world, in Israel or here. So whoops, that kind of made it hard for employers. They hesitated about keeping people on or about rehiring because of that, and that is a factor that's never been studied. I'm not saying that's monocausal. We are all very well familiar with the other events that happened in the late 20s that made that downturn so severe. Some are monetary, some relate to credit, some relate to just the business cycle. The stock market went too high, sure it did, in 28, 29. But when you compare the early 20s to 29, and we want to do that, you see that the early 20s recession was where government said, we'll manage the money to keep it stable, even by raising interest rates, and otherwise we're going to butt out. Whereas by 29, you had a jump in activist culture, and that did not seem to work in terms of recovery. We never got, in fact, back to the stock market level we were at in 29 with our Dow Jones until the 1950s, and unemployment in the 1930s, and that's the true measure of national happiness. We can all agree, conservative, liberal, or progressive. Unemployment in the 1930s was an abomination, nearly always above 10%, often averaging 15.
Mm-hmm. I see. So
in the 30s.
I got you. So the difference was a much more interventionist hand on the part of the administration that you're saying created or elongated the problem into the 50s.
Well, the stock market didn't come back to the 50s, and I don't believe the 1920s inflation or trouble was so great that you had to wait that long from 29 to the mid-50s for the stock market to come back. There had to be some negative things going on, and there were. The reason I mention labor is because that is completely understudied. And when an employer can lay someone off or reduce his wage because the business is in trouble, because the revenues are not coming in, that makes the employer much more likely to hire or rehire. And we see that today with all of our safeties, all of our regulations to protect the worker, we simultaneously see an enormous black market opening up or a temp market because employers just can't handle that many obligations and therefore employ that much less.
Right. That's certainly something we've seen in Israel. In fact, here recently they required that every single worker has to be on the pension plan of the company. So, for example, if you are a small company that has a cleaner who comes once a week for 2 hours, you have to go through all the paperwork and all the hassle of signing him up on your pension plan so that he ends up, having literally a few dollars a month put away for him. And the cost of administering this is so high, and it's such a hassle that, in fact, I speak to other small businessmen, they don't even want to deal with it.
We're talking about a tragedy in the case of Israel, and the tragedy of Israel is that Israel believed what the Keynesians who came out of the New Deal said. And Israel believed that unions were good when Israel was established, also this coming from Europe, and that unions were good for the economy. Unions are not terrible, but they can get in the way of economic growth and therefore job creation. And Israel didn't have to learn this lesson this long, this painfully. Mm-hmm. It took, and one reason that Israel felt justified in doing what it did was the Keynesian doctrine that the United States began to emit from about 1932. So by the time you get to the creation of the State of Israel, well, they have social democracy in Europe. Israel comes out of Europe. They have social democracy quasi in the United States. They have this concept that Keynesian spending, that whether it's infrastructure spending or other kinds of spending, is good to counteract say, a recession, that it's really a very high good. That comes from us. We taught Israel that. Europe taught Israel that. And you know what? It could be wrong. And Israel never had a chance to consider that. We didn't have it either. I mean, you hear it in the United States today with the contention that stimulus is the only answer. Interestingly, Germany, which is historically a stimulus country in our lifetimes, is now questioning this idea. And there's a whole revolution about economic thought in Germany at this moment.
I think it would be great here in Israel if we had some questioning also. It seems the problem.
Well, you do have questioning. You do have questioning in the form of the new high-tech sector. And one reason the high-tech sector was able to do well was the government, of course, didn't catch up in terms of regulation with this sector. The sector was doing stuff the government hadn't regulated yet. Am I right? So maybe in terms of hiring, the old rules applied, but many of the things, what is value, the tax structure hadn't caught up with that, and also you have the incredible ingenuity of the Israeli people who lug this burden of the social welfare state. But the point that I was trying to make is it's a burden that we invented here in the United States, or we supported, and it was really awful. It was wrong. It didn't have to happen.
I appreciate that, and I actually appreciate the wisdom as it comes to Israel, because, golly, I'm hoping that Bibi Netanyahu is listening to this. But certainly some
Well, I think Bibi Netanyahu knows some. I mean, I don't know him very well, but I think that he's heard some of it before. What's interesting is that the universities in the United States are beginning to shift.
Shift to the right?
In econ, there's more non-Keynesian discussion. And certainly more non-laborite discussion, because the evidence is there that it's hard to come out of a recession.
Well, I didn't think the evidence necessarily swayed what went on in the academic ivory towers.
Well, it doesn't when the unemployment rate is 6, but when it's 10, it begins to. So we have this sort of, you can hear the cracking of the surface of Keynesianism in the United States universities. It's a very slow crackling. Maybe someone who's a doctoral candidate, it won't affect his life. He might be stuck in that. You can hear the cracking of macroeconomics, because macroeconomics doesn't always work as an explanation. Micro is much more understandable. And in fact, in The Forgotten Man, I know you wanted to ask about this, there's a story of a kosher butcher family called, their name actually was Schechter. They lived in Brooklyn, and they broke the rules of the New Deal, specifically of a law called NIRA. We had an entity called the NRA from that government, and it governed them, businesses like this, and they fought back because the rules that emanated from the government were crazy, such as minimum wage or maximum hours, and they couldn't afford the minimum wage due to the, 1/5 of their industry had just died because of the recession, and also there was sort of a health culture that got in tension with kashrut, with the Jewish health culture. And they were prosecuted and as criminals, and their case went to the Supreme Court because it was a test of this National Recovery Administration, this government entity created to run the economy, and they prevailed. And so that's a compelling story, but it's also micro versus macro. They said, you know what? If the customer doesn't have money, I have to lower the price. Life from the point of view of the firm. If I don't have a lot of money, maybe I have to either hire fewer people or pay less, as much as I love my employees, for this period. Mm-hmm. Very simple, supply and demand versus a greater theory about aggregates. And so this was a signal victory. It limited the New Deal in the United States, and it was partly a Jewish victory.
I mean, I think a lot of the New Deal victories, for example, FDR's reforms, which included the SEC and the FDIC and Social Security, I mean, the fact that some of them still exist today, is that perhaps a sign that there was something to it?
Well, I'm just teaching this now. I teach at NYU Stern, MBAs. And FDIC is our deposit insurance, so that means, just like it sounds, that your money is insured. And when you look at the increments, the amount of your money that was insured, even when you take out the inflation, you see that it wasn't as much as it is today relative to what the average man earned. So we created deposit insurance, and it did seem to stabilize banks. If you look at a chart of bank failures from the 20s, which I just depicted so admiringly, you'll see one of the problems of the 20s was thousands of banks failed. When a bank failed, it wasn't the end of the world. Many were so-called unit banks, little banks with no connection or not much connection to other banks. When we got deposit insurance, which Roosevelt signed in the 30s, bank failures went down because the government was guaranteeing deposits. So you can say, good, it worked. However, over the longer term, there were problems from deposit insurance because it meant that the management at banks didn't really have to worry about their depositors because their depositors were guaranteed by the government, moral hazard. And we had a kind of hypocritical deregulation whereby we increased deposit insurance That is, we made the taxpayer liable, even as we said, let the banks be free and do things they didn't do before. So we kind of undid half the New Deal. There were other rules from the New Deal, including many constraints on banks. We let the banks be free to roam around the country and to invest in strange things, even as we increased deposit insurance, which is a recipe for disaster in our S&L crisis that we had. We had several, but the one I'm remembering came at the end of the Cold War, just about ate up the so-called peace dividend that the U.S. made when the Cold War ended, and we didn't have to have quite as much defense as before.
So if the FDIC, in fact, was real insurance, where the banks had to pay a real premium and the government would decide whether they were worthy of being insured, that would have solved some of this problem?
Well, if it were private insurance, yes, and banks can insure one another. They have over history. But there's something wrong when you go between a man or woman and his banker and put the government there. It makes the bank into a quasi-government office. And if you would enter a Chase or a Citibank today, I'm in New York, so I'm mentioning those. Of course, they're national now. I'm mentioning those. You don't get the feeling you're in a private company because there's several publics there. One public in the person of your interlocutor or the banker on the other side of the desk is the federal government, right? The public that guarantees your deposit. Another public is those shareholders, publicly traded banks, who have an interest in. There are an awful lot of parties at that table. The banker, you, the voter public, the shareholder public, metaphorically speaking, and you get the feeling that your interest is perhaps not primary at this table. This is not about my interest. And often consumer laws, again, the government involved. I think of Chuck Schumer often, our senator, who's a senior senator who's involved in banking, because I see him on the other side of the table because the banker says, Senator Schumer made this rule, or the lawmakers made this rule, and therefore the check from a foreign country doesn't clear for 20 days. Or therefore that's to protect you in case the check is from a bad man. You know what I mean?
Right.
So that government involvement in banking, which comes out of New Deal culture, I'm not sure has been productive for the United States net.
Interesting. And the SEC? That
Excuse me?
more?
Well, in the Forgotten Man book, which is the book we're talking about, I sort of have a rule. Anything that makes things clear and standardizes probably isn't so bad. There was an impulse in the United States which said we have 50 states, but we want to have a national economy. It makes sense to have national rules, like as in Europe now, the justification for the euro, which mostly worked, at least I would argue it did. Some rules nationally sometimes lead to clarity and therefore deeper markets. And I would put the SEC in that category. The rules-based aspect of the SEC is very helpful in the United States. The rules don't even have to be perfect. They just have to be consistent and true rules, tested over time and not changed easily. The aspect of the SEC that was problematic in the 1930s, and if anyone wants to read about that, Benjamin Anderson is the author, wrote a book about the 30s, was the prosecutorial aspect because it was so arbitrary. And the culture of arbitrary prosecution has slowed down the U.S. economy to the current day. And you see prosecutors saying, oh, but we have a deterrent effect if we're big and bad and scary and we go after one guy, everybody else is good, and that's economically efficient, sort of. But if the prosecutor is unpredictable, and our United States prosecutors are, well, then that also has a chilling effect in addition to a deterrent effect. And you see stuff that just doesn't happen, and that's what happened in the 30s. People were hesitant to do things because they didn't want to get all tangled up with the law.
I see. Well, the law is certainly was certainly written and gets more and more complicated every year. Listen, we're just about out of time. We have been talking with Amity Shlaes, who is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and wrote, among other best-selling books, The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, which was, I have to say, a fascinating read. Amity, maybe you could just tell us, what is the current project you're working on in the last minute here?
Well, we have two projects. One is the graphic version of The Forgotten Man, which is especially made for non-English audiences. There are many people who understand the concept of the Forgotten Man, which is the man who is left out by the machine politics, by the process, but who might not want to read 450 pages of arcane American history. Down to which legislator said what to what. The general theme of how the voter is left out of the process, even though he is the voter, is one we have in many countries. So I'm excited about the graphic Forgotten Man. I think one of my model books, in fact, is Walt with Bashir, even though I don't necessarily have an opinion on the foreign policy involved in it. Just I can see that graphic book was quite successful in a movie. Or Persepolis, maybe some of your listeners have seen Persepolis, about the Iranian Revolution from the point of view of a girl. Anyway, I have great faith in the graphic novel.
When do you expect it to come out?
Oh my gosh, I'm hoping the end of next year. And more importantly, I am the biographer of Calvin Coolidge, a friend of the Jews, the president you never knew about, who was before Herbert Hoover, born on the 4th of July and born in Vermont.
I see. And so that's the research you're doing now for
That is right. And this morning I'm reading the letters of Coolidge to his father. Coolidge is famous because for doing nothing. He's called Silent Cal. People don't like him. He's pretty low ranking. And what I found this is a drastic revision of an underly appreciated president, the forgotten president. That's what this book will be.
Okay, it sounds like it will be fascinating, and I am certainly looking forward to it. Amity Shlaes, I would like to thank you once again for joining us. Amity Shlaes is a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the best-selling book, which you should go out and buy too, The Forgotten Man. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.